My name is Aubrey Grant, and that night was supposed to be a simple family dinner in Dallas. I remember the chandelier light the soft jazz and how my father's voice carried through the restaurant like an announcement no one could ignore. He lifted his glass, smiling at my brother seated across the table. "Ryan is buying his first house," he said proudly, "and I'm giving him $350,000 to make it happen." Applause filled the room, forks clicked, and I tried to smile even as the air turned heavy. My mother reached for her wine. Ryan leaned back, pretending to be modest while the corner of his mouth twitched with satisfaction. I stayed quiet, cutting my chicken slowly, waiting for the moment to pass. Then my father looked at me. His tone softened, but it landed like a blow. "Aubrey," he said, "you'll cover this month's mortgage, right?" The table fell silent. Even the waiter froze. I looked at my plate at the perfect slice I had just made and felt something in me split with it. Ryan laughed first, then stopped when he saw I wasn't smiling. My mother avoided my eyes. I placed my fork down, carefully folded my napkin, and stood. No one asked where I was going. Outside, Dallas glowed gold through the rain-streaked window of my car. The city never looked more alive, and my family never felt further away. I started the engine and whispered to myself, that was the last dinner I ever stayed for. If you've ever been the one expected to fix what you didn't break, stay with me till the end. You might finally understand why silence can be the loudest answer. Fairness never had a seat at our table. When I was young, our house in the Dallas suburbs looked perfect from the outside, with trimmed lawns and fresh paint that gave the illusion of balance. Inside, everything revolved around my brother. Ryan followed Dad around the garage, learning how to read market charts and calculate returns, while I was asked to bring them lemonade or sweep the floor when they finished. He got lessons in confidence, I got reminders to stay useful. When Ryan messed up, Dad smiled and said, "Boys make mistakes." When I made the same kind of mistake, he would sigh and tell me to be more careful, as if I represented the family's reputation, and he was afraid I might break it. Mom always nodded along, insisting that it was normal, that this is just how families work. I learned to measure love by tone, not by fairness, and silence quickly became my habit. At school, Ryan's name carried weight because Dad's company sponsored events, while mine only appeared on the schedule board for coffee shop shifts. He arrived in a new car the day I started taking the city bus, and Mom waved from the porch, as if that was balance. I used to watch them laugh through the window when I came home late from work, smelling like espresso and exhaustion. There was always an invisible wall between their laughter and me. Every time I earned a small success, like an A on a hard exam or a scholarship letter, Dad said, "That's good, but don't get distracted." When Ryan got a new internship, he threw a barbecue to celebrate, and everyone raised their glasses to him. No one noticed that I stayed in the kitchen washing dishes so the table would look clean for his toast. Mom once told me, "You're strong like your father," but it never sounded like praise. It sounded like a warning to endure quietly to make things easier for everyone else. I started saving early, hiding small amounts from my part-time job in an old envelope, promising myself I would someday move where the rules of comparison didn't apply. By senior year, Ryan's life looked like a portfolio confidence support opportunity. Mine was a spreadsheet of hours worked and bills paid. When he graduated, Dad gifted him a watch. When I graduated, I bought my own dress, signed my own loan forms, and took a bus to the ceremony because the car was being used for Ryan's job interview. I remember standing in the crowd as the school band played. The sun was hot, the air heavy with pride that didn't belong to me. My family sat in the front row clapping when Ryan's friend received an award. When my name was called, they clapped too, but it sounded automatic, like a reflex. For the first time, I didn't wait for their approval. I looked at the stage lights and thought, this moment belongs to me. After graduation, Ryan took a vacation to Miami, paid for by Dad's gift for hard work. I started my first job 2 days later at a small accounting office in downtown Dallas, wearing a suit bought on clearance. On the first day, the manager asked why I wanted the position, and I told him the truth. I wanted to build something on my own. He smiled and said that was a good reason. It was the first real compliment I could remember. That night, sitting alone in my apartment with the hum of traffic outside, I realized independence didn't come with celebration or applause. It arrived quietly through every choice I made without permission. For the first time, I didn't feel invisible. I just felt free. That spring, Ryan turned 30. The celebration was held at a private dining hall in downtown Dallas, draped in white linen and gold light, the kind of place that smelled of champagne and formality. Most of the guests were Dad's colleagues, men in tailored suits who laughed too loudly, and women who wore diamond bracelets that caught the chandelier's glare. Waiters moved like clockwork between tables carrying trays of oysters and wine. I arrived 15 minutes late, clutching a small gift wrapped in silver paper, a framed photo of our family from years ago, when laughter had still sounded real. I had hesitated over the gift, wondering if it would seem out of place among expensive watches and monogrammed pens. Ryan was in the center of the room, surrounded by well-wishers. His grin was polished, rehearsed, like every word he said that night. Mom waved when she saw me, a brief flick of her hand, as if acknowledging an obligation rather than joy. I placed the photo on the gift table where it disappeared behind boxes wrapped in gold. Then I took my seat at the far end beside a quiet accountant from Dad's firm who nodded politely and went back to his steak. When the cake was brought out, candles glowing in perfect symmetry, Dad stood and tapped his glass. The room quieted instantly. He began speaking about legacy, hard work, and how proud he was to see his son becoming a man of ambition. Then he smiled and said he wanted to make sure Ryan started his next chapter with stability. He paused long enough for suspense before announcing that he was gifting $350,000 to help him buy a house. Applause broke out around me, sharp and immediate like hail on metal. Camera flashes burst across the table. Someone whistled. Ryan feigned humility, looking down at his plate before raising his glass and saying, "Guess Dad's proud of me." The laughter that followed was thick with admiration. I stayed silent, my hands resting on my napkin, the fabric wrinkled from how tightly I held it. I could feel eyes turning toward me, waiting for a reaction, maybe a smile or a polite nod. Instead, I kept looking at the candles flickering on the cake. Their flames wavered with every camera flash, like they too were struggling to hold steady. For a moment, I thought Dad would move on, but he didn't. He looked directly at me, his voice steady, almost casual. "Aubrey, he said you'll cover this month's mortgage, right?" The words dropped into the silence like a stone into still water. Conversations died mid-sentence. A waiter froze halfway to the table. Ryan's smile faltered, not out of guilt, but surprise, that Dad had turned the spotlight in another direction. Mom's lips parted slightly, yet she said nothing. I wanted to speak to ask if he was serious, but the answer was already there, written in the calm certainty of his tone. The moment stretched too long. Someone coughed, another reached for their glass to fill the void. I finally stood up, my chair scraping against the marble floor. My legs trembled, but my voice stayed calm when I said, "I think I've celebrated enough." No one tried to stop me. Not Ryan, not Mom, not Dad. Outside, the rain had started. Texas rain never came softly. It poured like it wanted to erase everything beneath it. I walked without an umbrella, heels tapping against wet pavement, the city lights warping into streaks of white and amber. My hair clung to my face, my dress damp and heavy. Still, I kept walking, each step louder than the last, the sound swallowed by thunder overhead. Behind me, the restaurant windows glowed warm, full of people who would forget this moment by dessert. Inside that room, they would laugh again, toast again, maybe even say my name in pity or annoyance. But outside, beneath the rain, I felt something shift. The air smelled like wet earth and release. When I reached my car, I looked once more at the restaurant's entrance where the valet stood under the awning. The laughter inside rose and fell like a wave I no longer needed to ride. I unlocked the door, sat down, and stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My mascara had run, but my eyes looked clear. That night wasn't just my brother's birthday. It was the last time I belonged to their version of family. The morning after I left my family, I moved into a one-bedroom apartment near downtown Dallas. The walls were bare, the carpet smelled faintly of paint, and the only furniture was a folding table I bought from a thrift store. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I worked as a freelance accountant, taking contract jobs from small businesses that couldn't afford full-time staff. Every invoice I sent felt like a step away from everything I had known. The days blurred together in quiet routine. I woke early, made coffee that tasted too strong, and opened my laptop at the same spot by the window. The sound of traffic below became a kind of rhythm that pushed me forward. I learned to live without noise from others, without the pressure to perform. It was strange at first, this stillness. Freedom didn't roar. It whispered. One afternoon, during a corporate tax seminar, I met Derek Miller. He was a financial analyst who had left his firm after refusing to manipulate client data. We started talking after the session, first about spreadsheets, then about values. He had the kind of calm focus that made people trust him. When I mentioned an idea I'd been sketching for months, a platform to help young professionals manage their finances and fund small projects, he leaned in and said, "That could actually work." A week later, we met again at a cafe near Main Street. Derek brought his laptop and a notebook full of diagrams. "We'll call it Fair Fund," he said, explaining how the name symbolized fairness and opportunity. His conviction made the idea feel possible. That night, I registered the domain name and drew the first wireframe. The next months became a cycle of work and exhaustion. I handled the accounting, logic, compliance, and early outreach to small business clients. Derek built the interface and modeled the investment system. Some nights we stayed in the office until dawn, eating takeout and writing code between half-finished mugs of coffee. On weekends, while the city went quiet, we planned our first pitch deck. Dr. Patel, my old friend from university, called one Friday evening after seeing my late-night messages online. She was now a therapist and insisted I meet her for dinner. "You sound like you're forgetting to breathe," she said. At the restaurant, she listened as I explained the idea of Fair Fund, how it was consuming every part of my day. She smiled gently and reminded me that purpose and burnout often wore the same face. It was the kind of conversation that reset something inside me. When I got home, I taped my apartment's rent invoice on the wall. It wasn't decoration. It was a reminder. Each month's number reminded me of the cost of independence, not just in money, but in the courage to keep going when no one believed in you. I began collecting them, one for every month that I stayed afloat. As Fair Fund grew, so did the sense of stability I had never known. We reached our first 100 users, then 200. Small entrepreneurs began writing thank you notes saying they had finally launched their projects because of us. Every message filled a part of me that family praise never could. I started noticing changes in myself too. I no longer checked my phone, waiting for apologies or calls that would never come. The apartment still echoed when I closed the door at night, but it didn't feel empty. It felt honest. By the end of the year, we were preparing to present Fair Fund to a group of investors. Derek was confident. I was terrified, but ready. On the morning of the presentation, I caught my reflection in the elevator mirror, no longer the woman who waited for approval, but someone who had learned to build from absence. That evening, after the meeting ended with several investors showing interest, I walked home through the same streets I had first arrived on months ago. The city lights flickered like quiet applause. I didn't think of revenge or recognition. I thought of peace, the kind that came from knowing I had started over and survived. A year later, Dallas looked smaller from my new balcony. The city lights shimmered beneath the night sky, reflections dancing across the lake that wrapped around the backyard of our new home. The water was still like glass, catching the silver glow of the moon. That house, $3 million, modern, wide open to the air, didn't feel like a monument to wealth. It felt like proof that peace had a place even after silence. FairFund had grown beyond what I ever imagined. The platform was no longer a startup running on sleepless nights and borrowed laptops. After months of investor meetings, we secured full funding and expanded into 3 states. I was promoted to Chief Financial Officer, a title that sounded foreign in my mouth, but fit the life I was building. My calendar filled with board meetings and press interviews, but no matter how public my work became, my personal world stayed small, intentional quiet. Alex Reed, my business partner, and now the man I shared this house with, walked out to the balcony holding 2 mugs of coffee. He had joined FairFund shortly after the investment round closed, first as an advisor, then as something more. He understood calm not as absence of noise, but as choice. When I told him I wanted a home where mornings began with still water instead of traffic, he found this property. We signed the papers 2 months later. Inside the house, sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows each morning, painting soft gold across the walls. In my office above the bookshelf hung a simple frame. Inside it was a wrinkled piece of paper, my first rent receipt from the apartment I had started over in. The ink had faded, but the numbers were still legible. Whenever I looked at it, I remembered the nights I had counted coins to make rent, the silence that once felt lonely but became my strength. That paper was worth more than any certificate or title. It was my proof of freedom. My family hadn't reached out since that night at Ryan's party. Birthdays, holidays, business milestones, they all passed without a word. At first, I thought the silence would ache forever. I expected guilt or longing to return, but instead, it was replaced by stillness, a peace that stayed. I no longer checked messages or replayed old memories in my mind. Some things heal not because they are fixed, but because you stop returning to where you were broken. There were nights when Alex found me sitting on the patio watching the reflections on the lake. The city skyline blinked in the distance, faint and distant, as if it belonged to another version of me. One evening, after a long day of meetings, I told him I sometimes wondered if I had done enough to prove myself, if cutting ties had been cruel. He looked at me for a long moment, then said softly, "You don't owe them proof, you're living it." His words settled into me like warm air after rain. It wasn't validation I had been seeking all these years. It was clarity. Everything I had built, every quiet decision, every sleepless night, it wasn't for revenge or recognition. It was for peace, the kind that didn't need applause to exist. FairFund's new office overlooked the city center, just a few blocks away from where I used to live. Sometimes I walked past that old building, the faded sign still hanging above the door. It reminded me of how fragile beginnings could be, and how much power there is in not giving up. The doorman, who still remembered my name, once said, "You've come far, Ms. Hale." I smiled and replied, "Far enough to feel home." At home, the air smelled of cedar and coffee. Alex's laugh carried from the kitchen, followed by the quiet hum of music playing through the speakers. I stood by the balcony again, tracing the skyline with my eyes. Dallas no longer felt like the city that had once held my pain. It looked smaller, softer, almost kind. I realized peace doesn't erase the past. It simply no longer asks for your attention. That night I sat by the window, the framed rent receipt gleaming under the lamp. The paper curled at the edges, fragile but intact like me. I wasn't chasing approval anymore. I had built something solid out of everything that once broke me. By the next winter, trouble had Ryan's address. His name filled the business pages for all the wrong reasons. Headlines told of failed investments, unpaid loans, and investors demanding accountability. The articles mentioned the same house my father had proudly bought him years ago, now up for foreclosure. I didn't look away when the news appeared on my phone, but I didn't reach out either. Pity had become a language I no longer spoke. FairFund was thriving, the team was expanding, and my schedule was a blur of meetings and flights. One evening, after returning from a conference in Chicago, I saw a black sedan parked by the front gate. Ryan stood beside it, suit, wrinkled hair, unkempt eyes, sunken like someone who hadn't slept in days. The security guard had already called me before letting him approach, but I told them to allow it. Some endings deserve a proper silence. He smiled weakly as I walked toward the entrance. "You look different," he said, glancing past me at the wide glass doors and manicured lawn. "Guess FairFund's treating you well." I nodded once and waited. He shifted his weight, cleared his throat, then finally spoke the reason he came. "I just need a little help, Aubrey. A loan, something short-term. I'll pay you back." I just need to breathe again. I remembered the night of his 30th birthday, the toast, my father's proud hand on his shoulder, and the laughter that followed. I remembered the moment when that same hand pointed at me, asking me to pay his mortgage. I had already spent years learning that silence was not weakness. It was control. "Ryan," I said quietly, "I hope you find a way through this. But I can't be part of it." His expression shifted from pleading to disbelief. "You're really going to do this?" "To your own brother," I didn't answer. The wind carried the faint sound of the lake beyond the yard. When he realized I wouldn't change my mind, he shook his head, muttered something about pride, and left without another word. 2 days later, my phone began to buzz non-stop. A post from Ryan had gone viral. He had written about a sister who forgot her roots, attaching a picture of our parents' old house, implying that I had abandoned the family for success. The comments multiplied faster than I could scroll. Some called me cold. Others called me an inspiration. The noise was deafening. Then came the calls from my parents. My mother's voice was sharp, wrapped in disappointment. "Aubrey, do you realize how this looks? People are calling us, asking what happened. You have to fix this. You're destroying our family's reputation." My father's tone was colder. "Do the right thing. He's your brother." I stared at the phone, their voices overlapping until they blurred into static. Alex came into the room, his eyes searching mine. "Do you want me to say something publicly?" he asked. I shook my head. "No. Let them talk." That night, I turned off every notification and opened my laptop. While the internet argued, I finished reviewing quarterly reports and prepared investor documents. The world outside burned with speculation, but inside my focus stayed unbroken. I had learned that silence could be louder than any defense. In the following weeks, the noise faded. People moved on to another scandal, another name. Ryan deleted his post, maybe out of shame, maybe because it stopped getting attention. My parents never apologized, but they stopped calling too. The absence felt familiar, almost comforting. One evening, as I worked late in my office, Alex placed a cup of tea beside me. "You're quiet," he said softly. I smiled faintly. "I'm learning that quiet doesn't mean powerless." He nodded, understanding without needing more words. I looked at the framed rent receipt again, hanging above my desk. It had survived every season, every storm, every silence. I realized then that I didn't need to defend the woman I had become. The world could misunderstand me, twist my story, and still it would not touch the peace I had earned. For the first time, I saw silence not as surrender, but as a kind of power, the kind that doesn't shout, doesn't explain, doesn't beg to be right. It simply endures. That spring, I walked onto the stage under gold lights. The hall shimmered with anticipation, cameras flashed like brief sparks, and the crowd quieted as I stepped behind the podium. The screen behind me glowed with the FairHome Foundation logo, a project that had taken shape over months of planning, late nights, and careful intention. It was the beginning of something larger than any business I had built before, a $750,000 fund dedicated to providing shelter and education for orphans and abandoned children across Texas. I had rehearsed my speech a dozen times, but standing there facing hundreds of faces, the words began to feel less like lines and more like a truth that had waited too long to be said. Among the guests, I noticed familiar silhouettes. My parents sat in the third row, my father's posture still straight, my mother's hands folded neatly in her lap. Ryan sat beside them, wearing the same forced smile I had seen too many times at family gatherings. To the audience, they looked like proud relatives supporting a success story. Only I knew the truth. The performance had simply changed stages. Alex stood near the front, his expression calm, steady, reminding me to breathe. I began speaking, my voice clear but warm, tracing the journey that led to this moment. FairHome was born from a simple question, I said. What happens to the children who have no place to return, to the room stilled? I let the silence stretch before continuing. Sometimes they are not just the ones left behind by strangers. Sometimes they are forgotten by their own families. Murmurs rippled through the audience. The camera light blinked red at the edge of the stage, catching every movement. When I was younger, I said slowly, I was told that helping meant sacrifice, that worth was measured by what you gave up for others. But over time, I learned something else. I learned that love without fairness becomes control. I learned that silence can be louder than approval. I glanced briefly at the front rows. My father's face froze as if the words had pressed against something he had buried deep. Ryan shifted in his seat, avoiding eye contact. I kept my gaze steady on the lights, not the faces. Years ago, I continued, I was told to pay someone else's mortgage. So I built a roof for those who had none. The hall erupted into applause. Some people stood. The sound rolled through the room like thunder breaking after rain. I felt the air vibrate around me but stayed still, letting the moment wash over without pride or resentment. On the large screen, the camera caught the audience, and briefly my father's unmoving expression. His hands rested on his knees, stiff and pale, his jaw locked. The applause only grew louder. As the ovation faded, I concluded, FairHome is not about charity. It is about restoring dignity. Every child deserves more than survival. They deserve safety, choice, and a voice. My last words lingered in the lights before I stepped back from the podium. When the ceremony ended, reporters clustered near the stage, flashes strobing against the gold backdrop. My parents rose slowly, pretending to clap, whispering to those around them as if nothing was wrong. Ryan looked like he wanted to approach, but the crowd formed a wall between us. I turned to Alex, who extended a hand. "Ready?" he asked. I nodded. We exited through a side corridor where the sound of applause faded behind closed doors. The air outside smelled of spring rain and fresh pavement. I didn't look back at the hall or at the people still talking inside. Some moments are not meant to be revisited. As we reached the car, Alex glanced at me. That line he said quietly about the roof, it was perfect. I smiled faintly. It wasn't written for them, I replied. It was written for me. Inside the car, the city lights blurred through the window as we drove away. My phone buzzed with messages, congratulations, articles, invitations, but I didn't open any of them. I watched the skyline shrink behind us, the glow of the hall dissolving into distance. For years, I had tried to find closure through explanation, through forgiveness, through words that never landed. But walking off that stage in silence, I understood something new. Sometimes the truest form of peace is not in being heard, but in knowing you no longer need to speak. The morning after the gala, Dallas felt quieter than ever. The city moved slowly beneath a haze of early light, and from the balcony I could see the lake reflecting a faint silver line of dawn. The papers had already arrived. On the front page of the business section was a familiar headline: former investor Aubrey Hale declared bankrupt. His company had collapsed under unpaid debts, and the article ended with a line about liquidation hearings scheduled for spring. Farther down the page, another piece mentioned my parents. They had sold their home and moved out of the neighborhood, downsizing, as the reporter gently phrased it. I folded the paper without finishing it. The world had moved on. There was no anger left in me, only a quiet recognition of endings that had finally completed their circle. Standing on that balcony, the same view that once symbolized distance now felt like closure. The wind was soft, brushing the curtains against the glass. The house behind me was silent except for the faint hum of the espresso machine. Alex had gone for an early run, leaving a note by the counter. "Let's walk later." I smiled at the simplicity of it. Peace, I realized, doesn't always arrive with a grand announcement. Sometimes it just slips in unnoticed and decides to stay. When Alex returned, we walked down the lake path, the one lined with young trees planted by the city after a storm years ago. Their branches arched above us, forming a loose canopy that filtered the morning light. He told me about an investor dinner next week, but my mind wandered elsewhere to the concept of freedom. How strange and simple it felt now. Freedom used to mean escaping, I said. Now it feels more like staying. Alex looked at me curious. Staying where I smiled. In my own life. FairHome Foundation had grown beyond our expectations. Donations came steadily, not just from corporations but from ordinary people who believed in the cause. Our first housing project had already opened its doors in Fort Worth, a cluster of small, sunlit homes painted in cheerful colors. Every month, I received letters from the children living there, handwritten notes in uneven lines, full of spelling mistakes and warmth. Thank you for my room. I like the blue walls. I want to help people like you someday. Each letter felt like a fragment of the life I had once wanted for myself, secure, unafraid enough, afraid. In the office, my days were full but not heavy. Meetings flowed smoothly. Our staff worked with purpose and kindness. There was laughter in the hallways, the kind that wasn't forced. I found myself lingering after hours, not from obligation, but because the quiet hum of work felt good. Sometimes I looked at the framed rent receipt still hanging in my office. It had survived every stage of my journey from struggle to success, and somehow it meant more now than ever. It reminded me that beginnings don't need approval to matter. That evening, Alex and I sat on the balcony again. The city lights shimmered across the lake like floating stars. He poured 2 glasses of wine and asked, "Do you ever think about them?" I knew he meant my family. Sometimes I admitted, not with anger, just with distance. I think we all became what we were meant to. He nodded his hand, finding mine. Do you regret any of it? I thought for a moment. No, I said, because without all of it, I wouldn't know what peace feels like. Later, as night deepened, I walked through the house, turning off the lights one by one. The glow from the city still spilled through the windows, reflecting off the glass and painting soft patterns on the floor. I stopped by the framed letters from the children, some drawings, some crayon signatures, and felt a quiet warmth spreading in my chest. I whispered to the empty room, this peace was worth every storm. It wasn't triumph that filled me or pride. It was something simpler, acceptance. The understanding that not every wound needs a cure, not every loss requires repair. Sometimes the most powerful resolution is silence, the kind that doesn't come from defeat, but from choosing not to fight anymore. The past had already spoken loudly and long enough. Now it was my turn to live without needing to respond. Dallas glittered beyond the glass, the skyline reflected like molten gold on the lake. The air outside was cool, almost tender. I leaned against the window, watching the faint ripples on the water. For the first time in years, I felt that my story no longer needed to be told. It had already written itself into the lives I helped rebuild, into the homes standing strong where there once was emptiness. And that was enough. Silence isn't weakness. It's the space where dignity grows. Sometimes the only way to heal is to walk away and let consequences speak for themselves. You don't owe anyone the version of you that keeps them comfortable. You owe yourself the freedom to be at peace. Thank you for listening to the end of my story. If you've ever been in a family that asked too much and gave too little, share what you learned in the comments. Someone out there might need your voice today. Let's build a place where silence turns into strength.